Good morning. I'm the Reverend Tony Lorenzen, the minister at the Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society and the Unitarian Universalist Church in Meriden. And we are all really happy to have you with us here this morning for our Sunday service as we continue our month-long theme on imagination. The topic of this morning's service is imagine a world in which we took climate change seriously. We have a guest speaker with us this morning, Professor Evan Berry, who is going to speak to us about religion and spirituality in our climate future and the religious and spiritual dimensions of climate action and defending the environment, and how that environmental activism and those environmental changes in turn affect our religion and our spirituality and their practice. I invite you to join with me in the words of our chalice lighting, which are on your screen. May this light inspire us to work for justice always, racial justice, environmental justice, and economic justice. May its light show us the ways in which all these works are intertwined, that justice in one area requires justice in all areas. This week we'd like to wish a very happy birthday to a few people who celebrated birthdays in the past week. Happy birthday to Jackson Baskin and Anita Sanders, who had birthdays on January 19th. To Sarah Edelson Baskin, whose birthday is January 20th, and Nathan Padane, whose birthday is January 23rd. Happy birthday to all of you from all of us at the Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society and the Unitarian Universalist Church in Meriden. Hope you had a great day, each and every one of you.
Good morning. My name is Ed Edelson, and I'm a member of the Worship Committee. As Reverend Tony mentioned, our theme this month is imagination. Without imagination, there is no progress in the human condition. It is an unlimited resource, but still one that needs to be encouraged and fostered in all of us. Today, we want to turn our focus onto the important subject of climate change, and specifically the role of religious organizations and faith traditions. Both our time for all ages and our guest speaker use the tool of imagining a future and thinking about how we can get to that future. Our guest speaker, Evan Berry, is an assistant professor of environmental humanities in Arizona State University's School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. Evan will be joining us live during the coffee hour, so please zoom in if you would like to talk to him directly. You may wonder how we found Evan all the way there in Arizona. The Green Sanctuary Committee at Mattituck Unitarian Universalist Society has held forums, many of them on climate change. Our last in-person speaker was Mitchell Thomashow, who led us to Professor Berry. We will begin with a short animation that talks about the Green New Deal narrated by one of its authors, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We have edited this a bit for time, but you can find the full version on YouTube. And now, our time for all ages.
The bullet train from New York to DC. It always brings me back to when I first started making this commute. In 2019, I was a freshman in the most diverse Congress in history. Up to that point, it was a critical time. I'll never forget the children in our community. They were so inspired to see this new class of politicians who reflected them, navigating the halls of power. It's often said, you can't be what you can't see. And for the first time, they saw themselves. I think there was something similar with the Green New Deal. We knew that we needed to save the planet and that we had all the technology to do it, but people were scared. They said it was too big, too fast, not practical. I think that's because they just couldn't picture it yet. And in the next year, when I was elected to Congress, the world's leading climate scientists declared another emergency. They told us that we had 12 years left to cut our emissions in half, or hundreds of millions of people would be more likely to face food and water shortages, poverty, and death. 12 years to change everything. How we got around, how we fed ourselves, how we made our stuff, how we lived and worked, everything. The only way to do it was to transform our economy, which we already knew was broken, since the vast majority of wealth was going to just a small handful of people, and most folks were falling further and further behind. It was a true turning point. Lots of people gave up. They said we were doomed. But some of us remembered that as a nation, we'd been in peril before. The Great Depression, World War II. We knew from our history how to pull together to overcome impossible odds. And at the very least, we owed it to our children to try. The wave began when Democrats took back the House in 2018, and then the Senate and the White House in 2020, and launched the decade of the Green New Deal, a flurry of legislation that kicked off our social and ecological transformation to save the planet. It was the kind of swing-for-the-fence ambition we needed. Finally, we were entertaining solutions on the scale of the crises we faced without leaving anyone behind. That included Medicare for All, the most popular social program in American history. We also introduced the federal jobs guarantee, a public option including dignified living wages for work. Funnily enough, the biggest problem in those early years was a labor shortage. We were building a national smart grid, retrofitting every building in America, putting trains like this one all across the country. We needed more workers. That group of kids from my neighborhood were right in the middle of it all, especially this one girl, Ileana. Her first job out of college was with AmeriCorps Climate, restoring wetlands and bayous in coastal Louisiana. Most of her friends were in her union, including some oil workers in transition. They took apart old pipelines and got to work planting mangroves with the same salary and benefits. Of course, when it came to healing the land, we had huge gaps in our knowledge. Luckily, indigenous communities offered generational expertise to help guide the way. Ileana got restless, tried her hand as a solar plant engineer for a while, but eventually made her career in raising the next generation as part of the Universal Child Care Initiative. As it turns out, caring for others is valuable, low-carbon work, and we started paying real money to folks like teachers, domestic workers, and home health aides. Those were years of massive change, and not all of it was good. When Hurricane Sheldon hit southern Florida, parts of Miami went underwater for the last time. But as we battled the floods, fires, and droughts, we knew how lucky we were to have started acting when we did. And we didn't just change the infrastructure, we changed how we did things. We became a society that was not only modern and wealthy, but dignified and humane too. By committing to universal rights like healthcare and meaningful work for all, we stopped being so scared of the future. We stopped being scared of each other, and we found our shared purpose. Ileana heard the call too, And in 2028, she ran for office in the first cycle of publicly funded election campaigns. And now she occupies the seat that I once held. I couldn't be more proud of her, a true child of the Green New Deal. When I think back to my first term in Congress, riding that old school Amtrak in 2019, all of this was still ahead of us. And the first big step was just closing our eyes and imagining it. We can be whatever we have the courage to see.
Low below me I feel no motion, standing on these mountains and plains, far away from the rolling ocean, still my dry land heart can say, I've been sailing all my life now, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home. Sun my sail and moon my rudder, as I ply the starry sea, leaning over the edge in wonder, casting questions into the deep, drifting here with my ship's companions, all we kindred pilgrim souls, making our way by the lights of the heavens in a beautiful blue boat home. I give thanks to the waves upholding me, and the great winds urging me on. Greet the infinite sea before me, sing the sky my sailor's song. I was born upon the fathoms, never harbor or port have I known. The wide universe is the ocean I travel, and the earth is my blue boat home.
Hi, my name is Evan Berry. I'm a professor of religious studies at Arizona State University, and I'm really excited for this opportunity to speak with you today about religion and spirituality in our climate future. I wanted to open my conversation with a passage from Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. This is taken from chapter 4, and it's section 144. He writes, "A consumerist vision of human beings, encouraged by the mechanisms of today's globalized economy, has a leveling effect on cultures, diminishing the immense variety which is the heritage of all of humanity. Attempts to resolve all the problems through uniform regulations or technical interventions can lead to overlooking the complexities of local problems which demand the active participation of all members of the community. New processes taking shape cannot always fit into frameworks imported from outside. They need to be based on local culture itself. As life and the world are dynamic realities, so our care for the world must also be flexible and dynamic. Merely technical solutions run the risk of addressing symptoms and not the more serious underlying problems. There is a need to respect the rights of peoples and cultures and to appreciate that the development of a social group presupposes a historical process which takes place within the cultural context and demands the constant and active involvement of local people from within their proper culture. Nor can the notion of a quality of life be imposed from without. For quality of life must be understood within the world of symbols and the customs proper to each group. The topic for this month is imagination. And in thinking about the future and in thinking about where climate change will lead the world in the decades ahead, I want to draw a distinction between hope and imagination. At the Rio Plus 20 convening of all the nations of the world in 2012, the 20th anniversary of the Rio Earth Summit, protesters who were disappointed by the governments of the world's inadequate pledges to reduce carbon emissions, they shouted, "This is not the future we want." The difference, I think, between hope and imagination is that imagination requires us to think about what kind of future we want and to actively imagine how to achieve it. One of the ways we might zero in on that is to think backwards about how we got to a future that we desire. I want to imagine a climate optimism that accepts responsibility for the harms we've caused, because responsibility is an essential ingredient any moral response to climate change. I'm imagining a future from which we can look back at the present in retrospect and see it with fresh eyes. This is a future in which we've achieved net zero carbon emissions by the year 2050, and where average global temperatures have stopped rising at about 1.5 over their historic levels. What did it take to get to that point, and what role will religion and spirituality have played looking backwards from the mid-century? That's the setup for the imagination exercise that I want to do with you today. So let's imagine ourselves as historians in the year 2050. In retrospect, it seems obvious how important the contributions of religiously affiliated non-government organizations were. Organizations that are faith-based or faith-adjacent or funded by religious institutions were always such important contributors to efforts on sustainable development, and more importantly, in humanitarian relief. As the climate crisis increasingly displaced people from their homes in the 2020s and 2030s, religious organizations were critical in handling the increasing flows of refugees and climate migrants. They're part of the reason we have binding international agreements on those issues today. But perhaps most importantly, religious organizations were the ones that lobbied their governments and pressured the United Nations to take more aggressive steps on climate adaptation. In the early 2020s, we started to have real consensus that the Paris Accords needed to have more aggressive climate mitigation, that the world's governments and economies needed to pollute less. But those agreements didn't have enough room and enough money devoted to adapting to climate change. It was faith-based organizations that played a really critical role in helping us think about how and where to spend money, specifically by helping local people understand and empower local people to grapple with the problems they were experiencing in their own ecosystems. Fishing communities needed to think clearly from their own perspective about what they were going to do about decreasing and depleted fishing stocks and ocean acidification. Farming communities that were in drought regions needed to think clearly about how whether migration or resettlement or adaptation of different kinds. And those decisions were always informed by local cultures and local traditions. That's the reason that I wanted to begin with the reading from Laudato Si. So one thing we can remember is how important it was that people supported faith-based and religiously affiliated non-government organizations. But religious institutions were important too. Starting in the early 2000s and following on about a decade of divestment efforts, religious institutions and faith communities began in earnest to divest themselves from fossil fuel related stock holdings. As they began to do that, they also used their public influence to pressure public organizations like pension funds to follow suit. And by the year 2030, there really wasn't any viable stock market around fossil fuel extractivism. That was one of the major reasons why the economy decarbonized in the 2030s. Religious institutions also decarbonized their own infrastructures. Schools, hospitals, and houses of worship that were connected to religious organizations moved away from fossil fuel energy. They put solar panels on the roofs, and they led the way among other kinds of civil society organizations in showing how not-for-profit groups can act without being forced to act by policy dictates. Also important were religious social movements. Climate movements like the Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Movement deepened their partnerships in the 2020s with religious organizations. And those kinds of movements got better and better at making it clear why climate change was a moral issue and a spiritual challenge. As people increasingly were able to explain on social media and on television, their action and their concern about climate change were grounded in deep spiritual reflection and in religious traditions of thought and ethics. Their messages were heard by much broader and broader audiences. And as young people in the 2020s and 2030s increasingly found spiritual camaraderie among organizations that authentically inhabited an intergenerational ecological solidarity, many centrist and conservative religious groups were compelled to re-examine their approaches. If you wanted young people to be a member of your community in the 2020s and 2030s, you needed to understand the link between environmental concern and spiritual well-being. These decades, the 2020s, the 2030s, and the 2040s, had a huge impact on religion and spirituality. It wasn't just that old models of religion and spirituality helped us make the changes we needed to, but the changes we experienced, the storms, the suffering, the droughts, the fires, the political turbulence, the geopolitical realignments as we ended our consumption of fossil fuels in the industrialized nations. Those major changes had real effects on people's religious and spiritual lives. Looking back, perhaps it even seems like the pandemic of 2020 and 2021 was a major turning point in the history of 21st century religion and spirituality. One thing that the pandemic taught us was how entangled people's spiritualities and religious lives were with capitalism and consumerism. Separating out people's desires for material goods from their desires for spiritual goods was one of the major things that came out of the cultural aftermath of the pandemic. People wrote books and talked about that, and art and music dealt with that for many years. We now have a clear sense that purchasing goods and buying things is a normal and healthy part of everyday life, but that those kinds of goods aren't ever going to be spiritually satisfactory. Our capitalist economy is now fully separated from our spiritual desires for a better future. One of the other things that became clear during the pandemic of the early 2020s was the relationship between religion and various forms of science denialism. The groups of people who denied the seriousness of the coronavirus pandemic were the very same people who denied the seriousness of climate change, which were also the same people who had a generation before denied the seriousness of health crises related to smoking, to overconsumption of sugar, and in fact, any kind of scientific constraints on big business. As we began to more clearly see the linkages between corporate power and religious rhetorics of denial, and the assertion that God's will can't be overturned by policy, as we more clearly saw how those things were linked, different groups from all sectors of society moved to more directly confront and marginalize the voices that spoke about coronavirus and climate hoaxerism. Those are no longer serious threads of American public life. But perhaps most important of all the changes that have happened over the last 30 years is a much deeper version of cultural pluralism. As we moved to put people in charge of their own communities, one of the places where early investments in climate adaptation saw the greatest successes were indigenous peoples movements. Efforts to return land to the care of its original stewards were wildly successful, and that those kinds of policies, which began in South America, but were increasingly taken up in the United States and in other nations of the global North, found real success in allowing Native peoples to be in charge of how land management schemes work. And in fact, we found very quickly that those kinds of schemes not only helped us slow the rate of carbon emissions, but that good land management in the hands of First Peoples was able to allow us to increase the rate by which ecosystems absorbed carbon. We had growing carbon sinks already by the end of the 2020s. But it wasn't simply the idea that those kinds of traditions, Native peoples movements, were important. A vital civic culture that saw religious difference as a source of resilience, innovation, and strength began to emerge in the late 2020s and early 2030s, as we began to see that it wasn't necessary to have a unified, singular national religious culture, and in fact, to think of local religious cultures and spiritual traditions as being really valuable in environmental stewardship. That was when we started to move away from top-down solutions to the climate crisis and started thinking about bottom-up solutions. When the federal government began to invest in those kinds of solutions to empower local people to be in charge of their own communities and to advance spiritual groups from all around the world to be in charge of their own spaces and their own destinies, even though those kinds of differences have led different groups of people in very different directions, as a whole, we're a much healthier global cultural ecosystem. I hope you've enjoyed this thought experiment. It was enjoyable for me to think this through. I'm actually recording these comments on January 20th, Inauguration Day, which is a day that has made it a lot easier to imagine backwards from a future that we want and desire and demand for our children and our grandchildren. Thanks, and I look forward to talking to you on the 24th.
For the beauty of the earth, for the splendor of the skies, for the love which from our birth over and around us lies. Source of all to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of it and I, for the heart and mind's delight, for the mystic harmony, linking sense to sound and sight. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the wonder of each hour, of the day and of the night, hill and vale and tree and flower, sun and moon and stars of light. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of human care, sister, brother, parent, child, for the kinship we all share, for all gentle thoughts and mild. Source of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise.
We hold dearly in our hearts with a lot of love and support this week Jack Landers and his sister Joanne, who's been hospitalized with COVID, Mary Lander and her mom. Her mom is in intensive care after a heart attack, Cassandra Hardaby, who had surgery this week, Barbara Klein, who is back in the hospital this week, my own Aunt Sylvia, who died this past Wednesday, Connie Welton, who has moved from the hospital to rehab, Randy Heath, who will be having neck surgery, Kathy Lindberg, who's recovering from COVID, Dawn Dell, who will be having back surgery February 3rd, Donna Stimson, who's been having some health issues, Lisa Quint, who will be having surgery soon, and all those struggling with disease and illnesses, visible and invisible. We hold them dearly in our hearts and lend them all our support. We've come to the end of the service, and so we extinguish our chalice flame, but we always carry that flame with us in our hearts. May the light within our hearts guide us to love and care for this planet we call home. Go in peace, holy ones. We'll see you next week.
Our service may be drawing to a close, but there's always coffee hour. Please pour a cup of your favorite beverage and zoom on in. Join us for coffee at go.uucentralct.org/coffee. That's go.uucentralct.org/coffee. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Amen.